found it. The Legend of the Demon Hunter. No. Oh, are you kidding me? No. There's not a single picture in here. This belongs in a museum. How is it supposed to retain anyone's attention without a single picture? Oh my god, there's nothing in here. There's nothing at all. Idea. I have an idea. Where is it? Hello? Kyng-Pin? Yeah, it's me, Holmes. No, not Holmes. Holmes. Yeah, that one. Listen, found a really cool ancient book, but, it needs a little something more. It needs a little spice. If I read it to you, would you be able to create a picture or a graphic for something in your, little photo market program? Yeah, Photoshop, whatever. You can? Awesome, great. Thank you so much. I owe you for this. And so, the legend goes...
Have you ever encountered literal hell on Earth? Have you ever stood before the devil incarnate? I pray such a fate doesn't befall upon you, but others were never so lucky. Many years ago, on a dark and foggy night, there lived a family in a humble log cabin. Jake Bloodmoon moved out into the woods with his wife Persephone and their two sons, Benny and Kenny, after landing himself in some hot water with the local mob. Unbeknownst to the Bloodmoons, though, this mob was run by the devil himself, and he wasn't too fond of Jake ducking out on him. The devil waited patiently for months, letting Jake think he and his family were safe. But at the dawn of the midnight hour on Halloween night, he struck. As quiet as a church mouse, the devil crept toward the Bloodmoon's cabin, and with a flick of his finger, lit a small flame on a patch of dry leaves a few inches from the cabin. Then he snuck into the house, ready to collect the souls of Persephone, Benny, and Kenny to pay off Jake's debt. A scream from down the hall jolted Benny awake. He looked over to see his brother still sleeping peacefully. Slowly, Benny climbed out of bed and went to investigate. He headed towards his parents' bedroom where the scream seemed to originate. Benny peeked through the crack in the door, and what he saw was a nightmare. Bathed in blood was Benny's mother, who was kneeling beside her husband, tearing into him with her new claws. Benny slowly tried to back away, but wasn't careful enough, and placed his foot on a creaky floorboard. What was once Persephone turned to face the source of the noise, and Benny could see her eyes were glowing a ferocious, sickly yellow. Terrified, Benny bolted down the hall into the main living area of the house. Frantically searching for a place to hide, his eyes landed upon the door to the basement, which he never went down into before. He threw the latch and descended the stairs 2 at a time, only to come across a room that was only slightly bigger than a closet. Benny pulled the cord on the room's one light bulb and found himself staring at a faded image of his distorted reflection. He was looking directly into the chest plate of a full suit of armor and sword. Curious as to why an item like this would be in the basement of his family's log cabin, Benny walked around examining the armor. It seemed old, but still functional, like it was recently used. The sword itself was intricate in its design. All along the blade were carvings and symbols, but what intrigued Benny the most was the glass ball just above the handle of the sword. Within this glass ball was a colorless rock that seemed to be suspended in the ball's center. Lost in the grooves of the armor's etchings, Benny was brought back to reality by the shrill cry from his now possessed mother. He heard the thud of her feet and the scraping of her talons on the wooden panels as she got closer and closer to the basement door. Benny's blood froze as the basement door opened, and amidst a pillar of thick black smoke, he saw the silhouette of a demon that was once his own mother. Almost as if a deeply buried instinct was coming to the surface, Benny dove into the armor and took hold of the sword. When Benny grabbed the sword, A two-way connection was formed between the boy and the weapon. Benny could feel the power of the blade rushing through him, and the sword could feel all the rage and fear in Benny's bones, turning the suspended stone into a radiant crimson color. With his courage amplified by the blade's power, Benny lunged up the stairs at the demon, making a deep cut in her chest with a swift strike. The demon howled in pain and began to thrash violently as the gash in its chest began to spit out embers. Benny pushed back and switched to a defensive position, blocking each attack with speed and precision that he's never experienced before. After enduring the onslaught of attacks, Benny thrust himself forward, staggering the beast, and in its moment of weakness, Benny struck. He pushed the point of the sword straight through the demon's chest. The creature struggled to pry itself off the blade, but Benny held firm. The beast's movements became weaker and less frequent, until it stopped. For a moment, all was still. Then the fallen demon dissipated into another flurry of embers inside of the smoking cabin. Despite the growing flames, Benny just stood there for a moment, taking in all that happened in a short amount of time. He let the sword fall to the ground beside him and stared into nothingness. For how long? He did not know. It was the thought of his brother Kenny that finally got him to unfreeze. Worried he might be too late, Benny rushed back to their room, which was safe from the flames for the time being. When he stepped through the door, he found Kenny still peacefully sleeping, 2 feet above his bed. Panic set in. Was this what happened to their mother? Was it too late for Kenny? He didn't want to find out. Benny rushed over and ripped Kenny away from his bed, hoisting him over his shoulder. Benny carried Kenny back into the living room, picked up his sword from the floor, and burst out the front door. Lit only by the moonlight and the raging inferno of his family's cabin, Benny set into the woods with his brother in tow. Time had no relevance anymore. Benny couldn't tell how long he was running, but the woods seemed to never end. After a while, his brother began to stir. Kenny began twitching and shaking and started making frightening growling noises. At the sound of tearing flesh and crunching bones, Benny turned to look at his brother on his shoulder and saw that he was transforming. Kenny's skin was blood red and his head had sprouted horns, just like his mother had done. Though, something else was happening to Kenny that Benny did not see with his mother. Kenny's back began to arch and sprout 2 enormous sharp wings. If he didn't act fast, one of those wings was going to take his head off. Benny flipped his brother over his shoulder and threw him to the ground. The demon recovered and took an offensive stance, ready to lunge at his ex-brother. Benny tightened the grip on his sword and stood his ground waiting. The demon pounced, but in one swift motion, Benny evaded the attack and struck back. Benny's former brother tumbled to the ground, writhing in pain. When the dust settled, the creature was missing an arm and half of one of its wings. Through the embers erupting from the demon's wounds, Benny approached him, his sword glowing the same crimson red as before. But it was no longer his fear that powered the blade, but vengeance. As the beast tried to crawl away on its hands and knees, Benny raised the sword and drove it right through the back of the demon's head. With one final agonizing scream, the demon fell limp and evaporated into a flurry of embers. But Benny knew this wasn't the end. As he stood in the forest surrounded by darkness, he knew what his life had become. He knew what he had to do. He swore right then and there to continue to rid this world of demons until one day he can kill the devil himself.
Yep. I'm sending it over to you right now. There you go. And, Holmes, one more thing I should have told you. Oh, wait, hold up 1 second. And there you have it. The entry for Benny's Spooky Edit War 2022. I hope you enjoyed it, and I wish all of you a very spooky Halloween. Speaking of which, for Halloween, I want to go as a YouTuber, so if you could just hit that subscribe button and that like button, I could put the finishing touches on my costume. Have a good day. What? Oh, right. Oh, yeah, Holmes. That book, yeah, that's guarded by demons, so you might want to start running. Like now.